Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Faye D'Souza. We're looking at a very interesting development really in the world of politics. We don't normally spend too much time on politics, but we're entering election season again, and a lot of what happens in our country is going to be sort of commanded by the elections. So it's important to take a look at it. And also, we got some really good guests for you today, so we thought that this was a good day to actually have this discussion. Let me tell you what's been happening. Now, the BJP has made 4 chief minister changes in the last 6 months without warning and without any clear justification of what's happening. There's been speculation of, was their performance bad? What is the reason? But there's been no clear stated reason of why these changes are being made. And we're not counting here the change made in Assam. So, for example, in Gujarat, over the weekend, on the 11th, Vijay Rupani resigned and he was replaced by Bhupendra Patel. Interesting thing about Bhupendra Patel, first time MLA, complete surprise announcement. Nobody knows, including his family, didn't know where that came from. In Karnataka, B.S. Yadurappa, very experienced politician, very popular, very strong politician locally in Karnataka, has given the BJP a very strong foothold in the only South Indian state there. Didn't go very quietly, but eventually did concede, was replaced by Basavaraj Bommai. Uttarakhand, very interesting again, has had 3 chief ministerial changes in just 6 months. So we had Trivendra Singh Rawat, who was replaced by Tiraj Singh Rawat, and then Pushkar Singh Dhami. So what's happening? And the interesting part about it is, whenever something like this happens, obviously there's a flurry of reporting. Everybody's trying to find out what really happened. And we get a lot of this high command type conversation, right? The high command will tell us what to do. The high command will announce the next chief minister. We will do whatever the high command says. This has been noted by many senior journalists who have said that this sort of talk about a high command that does everything and decides everything is very Congress-like. It's something that we're used to hearing from or about the Congress, that the high command decides everything. The BJP was meant to be a more egalitarian system. Has that changed? Is this a new BJP? What is the strategy behind making all of these changes? That's what we're trying to look at today. Joining us today, we have Mr. Javed Ansari, who's a very senior journalist, and Ms. Neerja Chowdhury, who will join us in a bit as well. We're waiting for her to join. Mr. Ansari is here already. Mr. Ansari, good evening. Thank you for giving us time. What initially, from just looking at these changes, is this a new kind of BJP? Is it different from, the BJP of Mr. Vajpayee, Mr. Advani? Is this high command sort of this thing? Do you see this as stronger? Or can you tell us how you're reading this situation?
Look, the high command has always existed. There's been a high command culture in all parties. It was very pronounced in the Congress, when Congress was riding high, when more so in the time of Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. As the Congress party has diminished, receded from power, so has the authority of its central leadership. Now, the BJP is on the ascendant. Mr. Modi is arguably the tallest leader, the most powerful political leader in the country, and therefore he is the one who does all the heavy lifting for the party. He's the one who gets in all the votes, and therefore he's in total command. The control and command of not just the government, but of the party is with Mr. Modi and with Mr. Shah. And therefore their word is law. They can affect changes when there is a strategy behind it. There's a method to what is happening. He realizes that there are some loopholes that need to be fixed, and they're doing it. And the smart thing is that they're doing it well ahead of the elections. Earlier, changes would be effected with just a couple of months left for the elections, leaving the incumbent with hardly any elbow room, hardly enough time to find his feet or build some kind of momentum. Now, Gujarat elections are more than a year from now. A year is good enough time to be able to establish yourself, to find your feet, to build some kind of momentum. It also helps the central leadership. They realize that post-COVID and because of the economy, the newspapers and television chat shows may say something else, but the reality on the ground is different. And the politicians are not foolish. They have their ears tuned to the ground. The feedback that they're getting from their workers is that all is not well, and you have to give them credit. At least they're making an effort to try and address that situation.
So, forgive me for interrupting you, Mr. Ansari. So what you're saying is that with these changes of chief ministers, it sends a message to the people on the ground that we are aware in Delhi that there's a problem here. And so we're making changes to acknowledge that problem. Is that the message you're reading from the BJP?
Yes, and that the ones who were thought to be responsible, whether it was a Dr. Harshvardhan in Delhi, whether it's Mr. Rupani in Gujarat, whether it was Mr. Yediyurappa in Karnataka, or
Yes.
whether those two gentlemen there have been so many changes in Uttarakhand that one has lost count and one forgets the names. So these were people who were responsible. We've moved them out. Now there's a new team that has come in and we are starting anew. At least this is the message that they would like to convey. This is what they are banking on. Whether or not people really buy into this, we'll only know in times to come. But the fact this appears to be the broad contours of their strategy.
Also, there's another pattern that emerges that I want to talk to you about. And Karnataka doesn't follow that pattern in the selection of Basavaraj Bommai because he's a fairly known politician, at least to those people who track politics in Karnataka. But the other choices, Bhupendra Patel in Gujarat, first time MLA. In Uttarakhand, you said yourself, people have trouble remembering who the Chief Minister of Uttarakhand is in Tiraj Singh Rawat or Pushkar Singh Dhami. Also, Mansukh Mandavia is our new health minister. I know the journalists were looking him up, saying, what is his qualification? Where does he come from? Because we didn't know. He was not particularly, high up in the BJP. Is there a trend of picking people who are completely obscure and then putting them in these positions?
Yes, with Mr. Modi, that is the case. He tends to go against conventional wisdom, tends to surprise. And I've always said it, and I've said it a number of times on your show as well, that it's really foolhardy to try and second guess Mr. Modi, because he always tends, even those who claim to be on the inside track with him and with the BJP, often end up eating crow, because he will always tend to surprise. Except as in the case of Mr. Bommai, where he's gone with the established caste, and also here with Mr. Bhupendra Patel. But the choice of the individual is very surprising. Nobody knew him, nobody recognized him. He was apparently sitting in the last row, and the photographer was scurrying around trying to find out where he was, and then trying to get a mugshot of him. So that's Mr. Modi. He tries to go against the trend, tries to set the trend. And Mr. Modi prides himself, and he said this on more occasion than once, that maine jan ka man badal diya, that I've changed the mindset of the people. He does believe, he has that immense, huge confidence in himself that he can change the tide. I mean, he can set the trend. Sometimes it succeeds, but sometimes it doesn't. But there are times that it doesn't.
I'm told Neerja Chowdhury has joined us. Ms. Chowdhury, good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
Mr. Ansari was just examining, I'm sure you've heard some of it, of the changes. We talked about why the BJP is making these changes of chief ministers and choosing also rather obscure names, with the exception of Karnataka, where they've chosen Basavaraj Bommai. What is your reading of the strategy? Is it to send a message that we're making changes, we acknowledge there was a mess up in COVID, or is it something else?
I think
before Neerja begins, you introduced me as a very senior journalist. How are you going to introduce Neerja ji?
As I always do, a path leader, especially for women in journalism. I keep I tell my audience that Neerja Chowdhury
It's
won
always
the award.
such a privilege to share screen space with Neerja ji and with you.
Oh,
Neerja
Javed,
Chowdhury
that's
won
very
the
nice.
award for a woman journalist, the Chameli Devi Award back in 1981, which is the year that I was born in. So that just puts everything into perspective.
Neerja qualifies for a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Oh, Javed and Faye, you really make me feel, what do I say? Good.
Loved and appreciated, ma'am. Loved and
And
appreciated.
yes, thank you very much. Yeah. And as a journalist, as a media person, when things are not the way they should be. Anyway, your question, I think, yes, it is an acknowledgement that things went very wrong and that people are, I saw in many places, angry. Other places, disillusioned. They may be quiet. They may look for change. And therefore, you have to not have the same face in the next election, next round. Karnataka is very different because Karnataka, they wanted a change. For a long time, they wanted Mr. Yediyurappa out. Mr. Yediyurappa is not part of the Modi-Shah team. And essentially, we have to understand that Mr. Modi is putting his own team in place. People who are going to be completely loyal to him are going to be his people. So that is the overall direction in which they wanted to move. Second part is the COVID story and the mismanagement of it. And I think in Gujarat is very critical for Mr. Modi. Gujarat is a state they cannot afford to lose and hope to stay in power in Delhi. So Gujarat is 14 months away. If you remember last time, Congress won as many as 77 seats. I think it was 77. And Congress put up a very good fight. It was in the last lap that Narendra Modi came and went to town in his, which normally is very politically correct. But in that last lap, he just was, his blistering self. And somewhere, talking to people afterwards, they felt we couldn't let, things were wrong, but we couldn't let him down. It was Modi's fight. And therefore, Modi being Prime Minister, Gujarat couldn't let him down. Yes. Now, this change has been coming. Mr. Rupani has lost ground. We know that. Since last year, they have been contemplating a change there. But there is factionalism in the Gujarat BJP, huge factionalism. And Mr. Rupani was brought there. He was Amit Shah's man, if you remember. Anandiben Patel was removed. Anandiben Patel was, if you remember, Mr. Modi became Prime Minister. At that time, there was a speculation that Amit Shah may become the Chief Minister of Gujarat. And Mr. Modi chose Anandiben Patel because she was the closest to him. And because of a series of circumstances and, the tussles that have gone on, Mr. Rupani was brought. Mr. Rupani has been Amit Shah's person, but he did not come up to scratch. Therefore, a change had to be made in good time. And instead of having the leader of a faction, one of the factions, whether it was Nitin Patel or some, they had to have a patidar there, Faye, number one. Instead of having the leader of one of the factions, Mr. Modi chose to bring in somebody who's totally unknown. Therefore, what is your overall message? Just to sum it all up, overall message is it's going to be Mr. Narendra Modi's face in 2022 Gujarat. It's going to be fought under him. And that strategy is going to be fashioned in Delhi. And therefore, they will have somebody who's a break from the past. You cannot afford to have a Mr. Rupani on the posters of BJP in Gujarat, given the association with what went wrong. Therefore, bring in somebody like Mr. Bhupendra Patel.
Ms. Chowdhury, is the argument here from the BJP that we can bring in someone who's a first-time MLA, who doesn't have necessarily the state-level experience, but because we're running it out of Delhi, the person's going to be fine, in the sense that there's no great track record here for the new chief minister, for any of the new chief ministers, except for Karnataka?
Yes, I think there is no track record. Somebody may do well, somebody may not rise up to the challenge, but everything is going to be controlled from New Delhi. And Mr. Modi, we have to understand, Yediyurappa was his own man. He had an appeal. He had a following amongst the Lingayats. In Gujarat, they need to put in patidar because the patidars have been unhappy. But after that message has gone, and this time they brought in a Kadwa patidar, Kadwa Patel. So far you've had Leva Patels, the Patels being divided broadly into those two categories. But I think we understand the direction in which things are going. And Gujarat, they feel nobody is going to be as potent, even in 2022, as Mr. Modi. And nor are they interested in, independent leaders with an independent following. That is the kind of record, we see even in the cabinet, the change that came about earlier this year.
Yes.
You had people who will perform, but not necessarily have an independent following in their own states.
Does that also then, and there are two questions that come up. One is, is this also a way to concentrate control in the High Command, Mr. Chowdhury?
Well, the control is concentrated in the High Command. I think
in the sense that Yadurappa was the only one in the whole lot who had any sort of personal following, and now he's out as well. So you have an entire layer of foot soldiers in these chief ministers, none of whom have any personal appeal or any sort of personal clout on the ground.
That's right. And I think, but who should be able to perform, who cannot be non-performers and therefore get flack, but who must not have, who need not have an independent following either in their communities or overall in the state. Yes, I think that is the direction in which things are going. That's the kind of leadership, that's the kind of team Modi all over that they want.
So I want to bring in Mr. Ansari on this. So where does Yogi Adityanath then fit into this structure?
Yeah, so that's
yes.
That's the point I wanted to make. That Yogi Adityanath is the only case which is slightly different. He has a following of his own. He is the chief minister of India's most populous state. It sends 80 MPs, the largest amount of MPs to the Lok Sabha, and it's not easy now to dislodge him. And he has a core constituency. He's even more hardcore than Mr. Shah and Mr. Modi. So therefore, he caters to the extreme right within Hindu society. And it is no secret that they did want, or they were toying with the idea of a change in Uttar Pradesh, and they couldn't because of the kind of support he enjoys and because also of his potential to damage. Because it's important. It's essential to have him inside the tent rather than have him outside the tent and doing damage inside.
Mr. Chowdhury, what is your reading of Yogi Adityanath? Interestingly, the campaign has not officially begun, but he has already started making statements. The latest one over the weekend about the fact that now he said, and I'm paraphrasing for our audience, he said now the distribution of ration is universal across everybody, but up until we came into power, it was only Abbajans who were actually digesting the ration. That was a deeply communal statement received by a disturbingly loud cheer from the audience that he was speaking to. So this is a man whose communal popularity obviously trumps his track record of performance during COVID.
Yes, absolutely. I think I agree with Javed's assessment on Yogi Adityanath that he will, to answer your question first, that the weekend statement about Abbajan, he will with everything try to continue to polarize the situation on Hindu-Muslim lines. And we will see this increasingly in the next 6 months before the elections. Secondly, they cannot, as Javed says, they cannot, replace him, which they would have liked. I think earlier this year they tried to do it. You remember they had sent this bureaucrat who had this confidence of the Prime Minister, Mr. A.K. Sharma. And he was also made an MLC. He was made a deputy chief minister to rein in Yogi Adityanath. And they had to take a step backward. Now, Yogi Adityanath has a following amongst the MLAs, but he also has a following in UP. But he also has a wider following beyond Uttar Pradesh. And if you remember, when the RSS people used to privately talk, about 2024, or 2029 more likely, they used to take two names at one point. One was Devendra Fadnavis and one was Yogi Adityanath. Now, Devendra Fadnavis, in the way the story has panned out, as you know, in Maharashtra, that is, I think, no longer on the horizon, certainly national politics for the moment. But Yogi Adityanath, yes. Even when he took over as a chief minister last time, it was a fait accompli, virtually a fait accompli for Mr. Modi, because he had his own group of MLAs, large enough, and he could have, gone rogue at that time also. The RSS wanted him. And I think the Modi Shah team felt, okay, let's go with him. At a slightly later date, we will bring him to Delhi and have somebody else there. Now that they have not been able to do, and Yogi Adityanath is playing his cards very well, given his wider mass following. And that following remains Hindu Hriday Samrat. So, which is what Mr. Modi also is. So I think how they deal with the Yogi phenomenon, the high command in Delhi at a future date, though they're going out of their town to support him at the moment, to build him up. And he also, if you look at the blitz of advertisements in the newspapers of Delhi, full pages on what Yogi Adityanath has done for women, for education, for COVID, etc., etc. And I think we will see more of that. But it is an interesting phenomenon, very interesting phenomenon, how they tackle Yogi Adityanath in the future.
I saw Mr. Ansari's hand to go up at the very beginning of the question. Mr. Ansari, go ahead.
Yeah, so what you've seen and what you're seeing and hearing from Mr. Yoginath is frighteningly only just the beginning. Elections have not even been announced. This is going to get more pronounced. This will get shriller and more vicious. And the people of UP, and I belong to UP, that's my home state, and I shudder to think, what will become. And I'm not being melodramatic. I don't want to dramatize this, but I think twice about visiting my village. I'm worried. I'm worried for my family. I'm worried for friends. I'm worried and these are friends from not just one community, but all communities, all liberal, like-minded people. And he is seemingly a law unto himself. If you criticize him, you run the risk of being charged with sedition, while he gets away with saying the worst kind of things. And the central leadership, the prime minister, is seemingly, just unable to do anything to rein him in, to control him. So the prime minister will talk of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, and at the very next moment, Mr. Yogi will say that rations are only for Abba Jan and not anymore. I mean, I really don't know. This is just one very frightening scenario.
Mr. Ansari, forgive me for asking this question, but I believe that maybe we've reached a point now where we should ask the question. In the other states, the BJP felt the need to make a change to the chief minister because they didn't think that they could, for example, take Mr. Rupani into elections, given the kind of carnage the second wave actually threw on to Gujarat. In Uttar Pradesh, is the reading right now on the ground that communal politics will trump the pain of COVID as well? That Yogi Adityanath is still extremely popular because of his Abbajan comments, because of his hardline view, that is still winning elections and will continue to win elections for the BJP, irrespective of what actually happens on the ground. Is that what we can read out of this?
Yes, certainly. You're very close to the point. Yeah, the fact that they've chosen to continue with him doesn't necessarily mean that it's out of love for him, but they realize that that's the expedient thing to do. That for them to win Uttar Pradesh is critical, because UP, they won the vast majority of the seats from Uttar Pradesh. 75 plus seats they won, 70 seats, the Lok Sabha seats the BJP won from Uttar Pradesh. So it's critical for the BJP, if they want to come back to power in 2024, to hold on to Uttar Pradesh. And they believe that Mr. Yogi and his brand of communal politics. So Mr. Yogi can do all the dirty work. The Prime Minister can adopt the moral high ground, and between the two of them, they hope to be able to tap into the kind of polarization, to the kind of animosity that has been built up in Uttar Pradesh. It has to be seen to be believed. I grew up in that state. I was born there. I was educated there. And now the kind of language that I hear, the terminology in use, the way things have changed, this is not the state. This is not the state. This is not the country that I was born in. I hope I don't get into trouble by saying this. And I say this with a great amount of anguish with a great amount of pain. It takes a lot for me to say this, and I'm not making a flippant comment, but the fact is that we've reached a stage where, it is just, it's beyond painful. I never imagined that I would live to see an India like this, and I would live to see where. And the worst is a comment like what Abba Jan has made, and there is no outrage except amongst a certain section of the people, which is predictable, which always happens. But beyond that, there is no outrage. I mean, what does it say? Can there be a sadder commentary on the times we live in? I don't know. Neerja ji is far more experienced, and she's seen so much more. She'll be able to throw light, but I'm deeply anguished. I'm deeply pained, honestly.
Neerja ji?
And deeply fearful.
I really, feel Javed's anguish and pain. I understand where he's coming from, because when you are, you brought up in a certain ethos, what used to be called the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb of Uttar Pradesh, and then to be surrounded by, hatred at a social level. It's a very, very difficult situation. But let me say this to Javed also. I have, after the farmers stir, the anger of the farmers in Uttar Pradesh, Western Uttar Pradesh, I have heard people, the very people who talked about, voting Modi and the BJP last time in 2019, 2014, who had seen the Muzaffarnagar communal clash, those very families talk a different language today. And they say we are not this time going to be taken in by the communal conflict, which we feel was deliberately created. We have seen through it. Our issues are, the farmers' issues have really, I know this for Western Uttar Pradesh, but not for the rest of the state. I don't know what Javed is right when he's saying what he's surrounded by, but there is the other side of the story which feels differently also, how much they're going to make a difference. And this is at the farmers level. And this is, of course, at the level of the families who have lost their loved ones. And let me say this, Faye, till today, that real picture has not come to light fully. We saw their bodies in the Ganges. We saw many things during those months of March, April, June, and May. But let's see how the election pans out. But there is an opposition out there slowly bestirring itself, getting together with Akhilesh Yadav and the RLD of Jayant Chowdhury and smaller parties. Are they going to be able to make a difference, enough of a difference? We don't know. But Western UP, certainly something new, a new voice is coming out of there.
A quick question, Neerja ji. We had Rakesh Tikhayat in his latest Panchayats make a statement saying that the farmers will now campaign against the BJP in Uttar Pradesh and in Uttarakhand. What sort of a difference do you think that is going to make on the ground?
I think, if you combine Western UP, and Javed will correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember, up to Bareilly, if you count that whole area of Western Uttar Pradesh, amounts to 120 assembly seats. And if you bring in the area where Samajwadi Party is also very active, the central part, at least you're looking at about 160 assembly seats, where this opposition combined has a very more than a fighting chance, particularly when they're supported by Rakesh Tikhayat and the farmers groups in Western Uttar Pradesh. Moving into the center is going to be a fight.
So I find the elections, going forward very fascinating, because we start talking about all of the states, but we wind up only talking about Uttar Pradesh because the stakes are so high. One of the things that I found very curious, and I'm not an experienced political journalist at all, was the fact that the BSP led by Mayawati had hosted something called a Brahmin conclave, which seemed to actually go against the very grain of what that party stands for. So in strategy, is Miss Mayawati trying to do something different in Uttar Pradesh, or is she just playing B team to the BJP? What's going on there?
You know, this is not the first time that she's gone in for this kind of outreach towards the Brahmins. She did this successfully. The last time she was in power was on her own, and it was on the basis of this Brahmin, Dalit, and a sizable section of Muslim support, which once upon a time the Congress used to enjoy. But then she withered all of it away by building those monuments and just going back on that Dalit agenda. She now appears to have realized and woken up late. She's been in hibernation for the last 7 years or 8 years that the BJP has been in power at the center. She's just woken up. Whether this will cut ice, one doesn't know. But she does, look, you can't wish her away, because as far as the Jatavs, as far as her caste, her community is concerned, she still is the prime vote catcher for them. So while the MPs and MLAs, for reasons we all know, sometimes tend to drift away once they are elected, she still commands a sizable control over a section of her voters. So they will continue to vote for her. And if she handpicks, say, people from the minorities in Western UP and puts up candidate, even where places where she doesn't win, she can damage. As far as Western UP is concerned, it's very critical for the BJP. It will make or break who forms government there, because of the 100 odd seats, if you leave the Bareilly region, or of the 120, if you include Bareilly, the BJP had close to 90 plus seats. And if this Tiket, RLD, and Akhilesh, if they can make a dent there, then the BJP will find it all the more difficult, because as you go into the hinterland, as you go into central UP and eastern UP, there the Yadav, the minorities, this kind of vote bank also has a large traction. So it's going to be difficult for the BJP to make up for those 70 seats from Western UP, which they could end up losing a sizable number.
Well, let me take our audience through the kind of elections we're expecting. It's February, March next year. There's Goa, Manipur, Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand. Then later in the year, November, December, there's Himachal Pradesh and Gujarat. And then, of course, the big question of Jammu and Kashmir, which has not been answered yet. But taking this to our experts here, Punjab, lots of movement happening on the Congress side in Punjab. They seem to be putting it together with masking tape. They're just not holding together on most days, maybe holding together on some days. What are you reading out of Punjab at this point? What do you think is likely to happen? Ms. Chowdhury?
I see Punjab as a mess. You know, if you remember for the Congress, if you remember 2 months ago also, maybe 3 months ago, everybody talked about Captain Amarinder Singh coming back to power because there was no alternative. And then you suddenly have an Navjot Singh Sidhu as the wild card introduced in Punjab, made the party chief against the wishes of the captain. Now, even if you Congress wanted to have a change of leadership in the state, younger person take over, there was a way of doing it. There was a way of doing it incrementally, slowly, having, working something out, because the captain is almost 80. But, what they have done is to have, and we all know that we don't need to go into it, and introduced a tussle in Punjab, a publicly fought war inside the Congress. It's a Congress versus Congress battle that's come to the front. And it's, every few days there is something or the other. There's another letter by Mr. Sidhu about what should be done, given to farmers. There's so many issues, on the issue of minimum support price, Artiyas, the whole thing that he's gone into a few hours ago. So where does it leave Punjab? Is the Congress going to do as well as a result? It's a question mark, because the Akalis are not picking up as they thought they would. And people have still not, I feel, forgiven them for their rule. Even though they've tied up with the Bahujan Samaj Party, arithmetically, it may look good. BJP is nowhere in the picture as of now. Therefore, the party that's quietly making progress is the Aam Aadmi Party. very quietly doing their work. Will it be a hung assembly? What happens then? Or will the Congress just manage to scrape through? As I said, Punjab has been very badly handled by the Congress party, where victory seemed almost certain for them.
Well, other than Punjab, the remaining states that are going up for elections, which is Goa, Manipur, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Himachal, Gujarat, are all BJP states or one BJP coalition state. So it's really about the BJP holding on to power in all of these spaces. Mr. Ansari, do you think, the BJP stands a pretty good chance of holding on to power in these states?
Well, Uttarakhand seems to be a tough one. They've changed multiple chief ministers, and by all accounts, Uttarakhand has developed a tradition like some other states, like Rajasthan and like Kerala used to, of every 5 years there being a change. By all accounts, unless of course the Congress shoots itself in the foot, which you can never rule out, the Congress should be able to put it past them. But look at the Congress. They've got Harish Rawat as their face. He is by all accounts their tallest leader in Uttarakhand. They've tied him up with general secretaryship in Punjab. He's trying to untie the mess in Punjab, while he should be out there in Uttarakhand, running around campaigning. As far as Punjab is concerned, it's the Congress which is intent on defeating the Congress. The Aam Aadmi Party, Neerja is right, it's Aam Aadmi Party is slowly coming up, but their biggest drawback is that they don't have a local face. Now, you can't have Bhagwant Singh Mann as your local face and expect people to take you seriously. The Akalis have their own set of problems. Ever since they effected this change and made Mr. Sidhu, the Congress ratings have fallen 20%. And this is not on account of the Akali and BSP tie-up or anything that Mr. Kejriwal may or may not be doing. It's purely on account of the fact that the Congress has decided to botch things up for itself. There's a singular lack of statesmanship, statecraft. You do things sensitively. The central leadership ought to have summoned both these people, sat them around the table and worked out a formula and made it clear that you just have to work. Whether by design or by accident, the impression that has gone around is that they want to undermine, they want to pull down Captain Amrinder Singh and bring up Mr. Sidhu. And Mr. Sidhu might be a lovely orator and he can have you in splits. But the fact is that whether he's chief minister material, whether he has any administrative experience, I'm not really sure about.
Mr. Chowdhury, of these states, where do you think the BJP has a fairly good chance of retaining power? Gujarat, for example, they haven't really had any sort of real, risk for a while now. Goa is another very interesting state at this point. What are the BJP's chances in retaining power in all of these states?
Look, at this stage, I would say Gujarat, they will do anything to retain power. And Gujarat, there is a Hardik Patel as the acting president of the Congress, but he's been uncharacteristically quiet of late. One would have thought that if BJP is preparing 14 months in advance and going in for a change of leader and its strategy, Congress should have done 28 months in advance. It had everything, as an opposition party to go against the ruling party, but it is not showing. Forget a killer instinct. It's not even showing a normal, average kind of opposition role in many of these states. And I sometimes wonder, why? Why? Is this, as Javed put it very politely, is this by design or is it, by default that this is happening? Because the central leadership is itself, caught in knots and things are not sorted out here. But so I think Gujarat, let me put it this way. The BJP will do anything possible, pull out all stops to retain its states. Now, whether Uttarakhand, yes, is a state that can be won. UP is a state where the opposition, if it doesn't win it, it will, make a good showing, and it may suit Narendra Modi that Yogi's wings get clipped They may come back to power in UP. They retain power, but it's not a repeat of last time. That may suit the High Command. Otherwise, Mr. Yogi Adityanath will become very large for them to, if he repeats the performance, to manage for the future for 2024. So I think, but actually wresting states away from the BJP, which may be theoretically possible given the ground situation, but the opposition is in no state to be able to mount that kind of challenge today. It's a very sad commentary on the opposition's role.
In fact, I'm going to leave it there, but I want to thank my guests for being so kind with their time and answering all of these questions. It's a fascinating time, and as has been pointed out, it's going to become more interesting. The reason why, like I said at the beginning of the show, the reason why we're looking at it is because whenever we enter an election season, which we are going to enter, most of next year is going to be spent with an eye on elections. A lot of what happens in our country happens with the elections in mind. So it's important to understand the dynamics behind those elections. Ms. Chowdhury and Mr. Ansari, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I do hope we can continue to talk as this develops. To our audience, our news is up at 9 o'clock. Remember, it is just the news. There's no opinion, there's no shouting, there's no drama. Do share it with your friends and family who might also benefit from simply listening to the news. Thank you for watching.